Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great weekend. Now that it's October, the library tour is taking a spooky detour. We're heading to the haunted shelves of the library to find out what lurks in the darkness. There in the horrors, the unnameable horrors. As we look at some cosmic horror, some fiction. These aren't all of my cosmic horror books, but it's a good sampling of them. Getting grouped by publisher. So we'll start off with HP Lovecraft's Book of Horror. This is an anthology that, it's not edited by HP Lovecraft. It includes his essay, basically a survey of supernatural horror and literature. And it has a bunch of the stories he references and discusses, and other stories he had praised. And so most of them are like turn of the century, so late 19th century and early 20th century writers. And there are some interesting selections, and there are some really, really good selections. Among the interesting selections, The Signalman by Charles Dickens. I don't think it's that strong of a story. Edward Bulwer Lytton is also represented, which is ludicrous. And Robert Louis Stevenson's The Body Snatcher, which is a good choice. That's not just name checking a famous writer. That's actually a good story. The Spider by Hans Heinz Ewers is fantastic. And then we get into some really good ones. Théophile Gautier's The Foot of the Mummy, and the absolute masterpiece Le Orla by Guy de Maupassant, which is one of my all-time favorite horror stories, ghost stories, paranoia stories. Just an absolute masterpiece. Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, Ambrose Bierce, The Damned Thing, and we F. Marion Crawford's The Upper Berth. But then we get into some that hey, this looks familiar. The Yellow Sign by Robert W. Chambers, who sort of helped build up this character of Hastur and the Yellow King that will be influential on Lovecraft's own writing. Shadows on the Wall by Mary Wilkins Freeman. And moving down, Lakundu by Edward Lucas White. That's frequently anthologized. Rudyard Kipling's Mark of the Beast. The Hog by William Hope Hodgson. The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, an absolute masterpiece. Count Magnus by M.R. James, another very strong. I don't know that that's James's best story. It's certainly not my favorite from him, but it's representative of what an amazing horror writer and that specific ghost story that he creates. But it also has a contemporary of Lovecraft, The Double Shadow by Clark Ashton Smith. So this is a good volume if you're interested in that type of supernatural fiction, horror fiction. The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen almost alone makes it worth the price, but quite a ludicrous cover, I'll add. And then I have a couple of volumes that were published from the Chaosium fiction, Call of Cthulhu fiction imprint. So I'll lead off with this older one, the Hastur Cycle. This is great. Some of these volumes that were published are really, really fantastic because they include sort of pre-Lovecraft stories, Lovecraft's own work, and then writers who are sort of younger contemporaries, writers who are about one generation on, and then writers who are two generations on. And this volume really, really does a good job of that. So we get the early writers who reference Hastur, High to the Shepherd and An Inhabitant of Carcosa by Ambrose Bierce. But then we get The Repair of Reputations and The Yellow Sign by Robert W. Chambers. So we have sort of this pre-Lovecraft sequence of works. Lovecraft himself is represented with The Whisperer and the Darkness. That next generation is then represented with The Return of Hastur by August Derleth, Tatters of the King by Lynn Carter. Novel of the Black Seal by Arthur Machen would sort of be contemporary. And so we have those. We get interesting selections. James Blish is represented with More Light, and he's usually thought of as a science fiction writer. But then we get the folks who are writing, 40, 50 years later and are really producing some strong stories. Or I should say 30 to 50 years later, because we have Ramsey Campbell's The Mine on Yugoth and The River of Night's Dream by the great Carl Edward Wagner, and we'll see more from both of them later on. But this is a really great volume. Doesn't necessarily deal with Cthulhu a lot, but deals with that sense of cosmic horror, these messenger type characters who point that there's this impending doom. Then we have the Ithaqa Cycle. Ithaca, of course, being referenced from Algernon Blackwood. So this is kind of fun. It's less heavy on Lovecraft really, and more like those cosmic horror writers, science fiction writers who dabbled in supernatural horror a little bit. And so this is a fun one. It's The Windwalker of the Icy Wastes. Super cool. This one's probably a little bit heavy on August Derleth. He's in here three times, but The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood, which is fantastic. Born of the Winds by Brian Lumley. We'll see him more. Footsteps in the Sky by Pierre Comtois. The Wind Has Teeth by G. Warlock Vance and Scott H. Urban. Country of the Wind by Pierre Comtois is also in here. And then I believe Wrath of the Windwalker by James Ambuel. There are others, but these are very different, I should say, from sort of the fishy type creatures that haunted many of the Lovecraft tales. I think it's a very different type of creature, monster. And it gives a different flavor. This is almost perfect for like winter, And I have this ridiculous the Necronomicon, which I found for a song, so I played the music of Eric Zahn, one of his pieces, and that was all I needed. But this is an interesting one. So we have a collection of stories, and then it has Lovecraft's commentary on the history of the Necronomicon, and then it has these fake attempts to write the fabled book. One from Elsbreg de Camp, a fragment from Frank Belknap Long, Lynn Carter's in here, the Dee translation referencing the great John Dee, the real life John Dee. But then in terms of the stories, Manly Wade Wellman, Frederick Pohl is in here is with a collaboration. Richard Tierney, Robert Silverberg, John Brunner, Fred Chappell. So a lot of familiar names and sort of works that people came up with, thinking of the type of horror that Lovecraft hinted at with his Forbidden Tomes. I've got The Return of the Sorcerer by Clark Ashton Smith. This really collects not all of his stories, but many of his best stories. I got this before the Penguin Classics volume had come out, and that one has, I think, more like notes and things. These stories don't have any notes. It's just a very quick, I think, 3-page introduction from Gene Wolfe. But the stories are here, and Clark Ashton Smith was kind of interesting. He had been wealthy, the stock market crashed, he wrote a bunch of stories, sort of regained some wealth later on, and stopped writing stories. But there's a different sensibility. He pushes Sathagwa, this crazy frog-like monster. But his stories aren't nearly as bleak. They're a little bit more magical and ethereal, and a little less bleak than Lovecraft. So I highly recommend Clark Ashton Smith if you're at all interested in that type of work. And I have a couple of Del Rey volumes. 4? Yeah, 4 Del Rey volumes. This is probably the best of them. This is Tales of the Cthulhu, Mythos, HP Lovecraft, and others. So we get really a sampling of some of the very, very best cosmic horror fiction from the 20th century. So Lovecraft is in here. We have The Call of Cthulhu. But we also, and Return of the Sorcerer and Ubo Sattla from Clark Ashton Smith. But we get The Black Stone from Robert E. Howard. That, again, is frequently anthologized, but it's a dynamite story. Howard has this character go and basically fall asleep, and then in his dreams, like, relive this, like, night ritual dance and sacrifice that's quite horrifying. But it also has these references to mysterious, forbidden tomes and a mysterious poet. So it works on a lot of levels. Frank Belknap Long is in here with a couple of stories. August Derleth is in here. Robert Bloch, he's famous for some other works he wrote. But then we get some other cool choices. So we have The Salem Horror from Henry Kuttner, Terror from the Depths by Fritz Lieber, Rising with Circe from Brian Lumley. Lumley we'll see later on, but his stories are much more like heroic. It feels a little bit like Indiana Jones as the cosmic investigator, less, doom and gloom. Let's see. Cold Print from Ramsey Campbell. That's a really creepy story. My Boat from Joanna Russ. Fantastic. And not truly horrifying, more supernatural and like strange. Styx, though, is sort of the reason to buy this. So Styx is a story by Carl Edward Wagner that deals with sort of the Lovecraft, mystique in the Cthulhu mythos. And it has a character going out into the woods and discovering these weird creations, with sticks, not stick figures, but like these weird creations of sticks that create geometric patterns and stuff. And so he then like sketches some as illustrations for a book of like lost horror tales or something. And it gradually goes from there. But those sticks that are described in the story helped inspire season 1 of True Detective. So there you go. The Freshman from Philip Jose Farmer is in here, along with Jerusalem's Lot from Stephen King, which is a really, I think one of King's probably best sort of like old school horror stories. So this is a very solid volume. And its companion is Cthulhu 2000, which has more like recent horror stories. And I like to dip into these. So we have The Barons from F. Paul Wilson, Pickman's Modem from Lawrence Watt Evans, Poppy Z. Bright is in here, Fred Chappell, who I had mentioned in a previous one. Another Joanna Russ story. Joanna Russ is so underrated, such an underrated, both science fiction and horror writer. Bruce Sterling, Black Man with a Horn from Ted Klein, who wrote just a half dozen stories. Last Feast of Harlequin from Thomas Ligotti. Shadow on the Doorstep by James P. Blaylock, Lord of the Land by Gene Wolfe, another Ramsey Campbell, The Face at Pine Dunes, On the Slab by Harlan Ellison, and 24 Views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai by Roger Zelazny. So there's some dynamite names in there, and these are stories of theirs sort of set in that type of cosmic horror realm that a lot of people just haven't read, and they're good stories from really good writers. I have Transition of HP Lovecraft, which I got many years ago before I had found the like the Penguin Classics editions that had all the notes from S.T. Joshi. And there are some strong stories in here, and there are some like weaker stories. Dagon, The White Ship, Arthur German, The Temple, Herbert West Reanimator, Lurking Fear, The Festival, The Unnameable. So a lot of stuff that's like good but not great. The Horror at Red Hook, which sucks, but it inspired Victor Laval's Battle of Black Tom, which is amazing. Cool Air, which is quite good. And then the big one is, this has At the Mountains of Madness in it, the full text about the Mountains of Madness. So this was one I had sort of picked up as I was discovering this realm. And then The Dream Cycle of H.P. Lovecraft, which has an introduction from Neil Gaiman. And that's, you know, if you ever see this in a used bookstore, I wouldn't say necessarily pick it up and read it. You know, buy it if you already have Lovecraft, or if you're not necessarily interested in his more like weird, longer dream stories, less like gripping nihilistic horror. If you don't want to deal with the ethereal, dreamy stuff he does, at least just spend 5 minutes and read the essay. It's a good essay. And Beyond the Wall of Sleep, Doom That Came to Sarnath, Statement of Randolph Carter, which is quite good. Nyarlathotep, The Nameless City, The Hound. I think that's a good story, actually. Pickman's Model, which is good. The Very Long Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which is sort of this interstitial linking of a lot of Lovecraft stories and the Cthulhu mythos and tying pieces together. It's just kind of boring. Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is very good. Dreams in the Witch House, which is scary. So there's some good stuff in here. Then I have Lovecraft Country from Matt Ruff, which I thought was not only a good book, but a pretty good TV show as well. We'll be seeing more from some of those. And then Brian Lumley, so I'd mentioned we would see him. So I talked about how his Lovecraft stories are much less apocalyptic, and you know everything's ending. I'm gonna throw myself over the ship, or I know they're coming for me tonight, and there's nothing I can do, or I'm gonna go join the deep ones that you get in some of the others. August Derleth then took it and said, hey, let's have some happy endings, which I think is going to inspire a video later this month. But Lumley went for a much more muscular approach. He almost took the ethos of Robert E. Howard's Sword and Sorcery tales and then fused that with the Cthulhu mythos. And so, okay, what would happen if you had somebody who learned about this stuff and was scared of it, but also like wanted to go hunt these suckers down? And that's what we get with Titus Crow. And so there's a couple of volumes from him. I have two of them. I have the first one, which has the Burrowers Beneath and the Transition of Titus Crow. The Burrowers Beneath is really good. And then I have the third one, which has In the Moons of Borea and Elysia. And so, you know, you've got Cthulhu is roused from slumber and is about to destroy all of mankind. These feel closer to maybe like the Hellboy adaptation that came out, like 16 years ago, 17 years ago now. These feel a little closer to that, but they can be very fun stories to read. And then I have the Best Ghost Stories of Algernon and Blackwood. It's just, you know, Plenty of good stuff here. Ancient Sorceries, which is maybe my favorite. I'm probably a minority opinion on that one. But the Wendigo, the Willows, great story. Secret Worship, Ancient Lights. There's The Empty House, Keeping His Promise. There's a lot of good stories in here. This is a good volume. And then a much more recent horror writer would be Laird Barron. So this is Occultation and Other Stories. These stories are frightening. They're not quite as horrifying as Thomas Ligotti's like worldview, with the idea of like life is this not just cosmic accident but like cosmic mistake. But these are frightening stories. I think 30, like the end of the script. I believe that's the symbol for the end of the script. That's a very, very good story. Occultation is very good. The Lagerstadt is good. Mysterium Tremendum is a long story. Strapato is pretty dark, and then 666 is quite dark. These are good stories, but make sure you're in the right mood, the right headspace, because they're pretty dark and they're very frightening. They're a little more graphic, I think, than Lovecraft. And then I have one of Barron's novels, the Croning, which is just as dark as his stories, I'll say. I don't want to spoil too much. This is a good, if you're into that type of horror, and you like some of those other writers I've mentioned, if you see this, you might really enjoy it. Go ahead and check it out. I then have a couple of the Wordsworth edition, like the blood drop black spine covers. So Ambrose, Bierce, Terror by Night, classic ghost and horror stories. Plenty of great stories in here, including, of course, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. But so many other stories, and Bierce was a very good short story writer. The satire, the cynicism that suffuses all of his work is very much present in his horror fiction. The ghost stories of Edith Wharton. I love Edith Wharton's ghost stories. I think her novels are very strong, but her ghost stories are, I think, very underrated. Triumph of Night, All Souls. All Souls is anthologized, I think, fairly frequently. Looking Glass, The Fullness of Life, The Duchess at Prayer, The Eyes. There are a lot of really, really good stories in here. And they have a different sensibility. Wharton had a very specific sensibility, and that comes through in these stories. If you are at all a fan of the ghost stories of Henry James, please check these out. These are fantastic. Then I have The Drug and Other Stories by Aleister Crowley. These are almost as interesting for like the setting that Crowley draws and the descriptions of the rooms and the clothes and what they're eating in the stories as the actual like horror or strange supernatural occurrences that are occurring within them. I don't necessarily know that these have the strongest plots, but they have these interesting descriptions that work to a large extent. And then this is a more recent acquisition, the Simon If stories and other works. I've read some of these now, and I thought they were interesting. You have a sort of decadent detective, a decadent Sherlock Holmes. If Mycroft and Sherlock had a cousin who really liked to imbibe in the opium a bit more frequently, or perhaps the needle, and then was engaging in detective fiction. The influence, though, not only of Conan Doyle, I think, but also of Edgar Allan Poe, and his detective stories really comes through in these works from the handful that I've read from Crowley. A half dozen that I've read. And then last, to end the shelf, is a couple of the books from the First Law trilogy, one of my favorite more recent fantasy series. So Joe Abercrombie, we have The Blade Itself. This is fantastic. This, it's been compared to like the Song of Ice and Fire, George R. Martin books in terms of like adult fantasy. So fantasy where it's not like whimsical, it's not bloodless, it's not passionless. All of those, there's blood, there's passion, there's all of that in this book. This reminds me, I would say, more of the Earth of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. Although very much set in a more medieval type society. There's not this sense of like futuristic, science fiction, like eons in the future. It feels more in a past. And it's very good, though. It has different characters who have the point of view, third-person narration. And I think that's one of the comparisons that works with the Song of Ice and Fire books. But these are great. We have Logan Nine Fingers, an infamous barbarian. We have Captain Giselle Dan Luthar. We have Inquisitor Glotka, who is my favorite. We have Bias, this old man who claims to be a wizard. But we also meet a couple of other characters, including a young woman who's really an interesting character. And we slowly see other, just the different interplay. And that then continues with Before They Are Hanged, which takes all the interesting conflicts that have started and lets them not just brew, but really explode. And then Last Judgment of Kings is the third book. That's out on loan to a friend. But this is a great, great trilogy if you're all into fantasy. It's been nice to notice on BookTube that there are other people who have read and loved this series. I felt kind of alone in my appreciation of it for a while, but this was a primarily cosmic horror shelf. Let me know if you've read these. Let me know if there are any of these artists that you have other works from that you really, really enjoy. I'm always interested in reading more works from the writers I love. And again, I hope everybody's doing well. Happy way pre-Halloween. Thanks.